edition of Thunderdome. This is 3.1, the first installment of Unit 3 and the most amazing curriculum ever to grace this green earth. Civics and economics. I know we're all excited about it today. Right. So here we go. Constitutional Convention. So this really, remember we learned before this, we had this Articles of Confederation, which caused us to have a weak federal government. We get together again, just like we would have done during the Continental Congress, and we come up with a new document, a framework of government, and this is that process. So who attended the Constitutional Convention? Each state, except Rhode Island, sent delegates to Philadelphia to fix the flaws of the Articles of Confederation. They weren't even necessarily going to write a new document. They might have just tried to change the Articles of Confederation, but they end up writing a whole new document. So most of the 55 men were well educated and experienced in politics. Native Americans, African Americans, and women were not included. And you'll see some of that. The fact that they weren't, you'll see some decisions made, that really didn't take into account any of those minorities. So, who attended the Constitutional Convention still? Benjamin Franklin, oldest delegate. He was 81 years old. At this moment, okay, in time, the 1780s, being 81 is ridiculous. It's like being 150.
Yeah, that's really old.
I mean, being 81 for this time is unbelievable. So he was a diplomat, a writer, an inventor, a scientist. He was also known as a ladies' man.
And
81. Yeah, and so two delegates, George Washington and James Madison, would later become presidents. And, both of those guys are from Virginia. Kind of have to know a little bit about Virginia at this time. It's the most populous state. It's the biggest state. Probably the state that means the most, in early stages of the United States. All right, come on now.
17 out of 50.
Oh, no.
I have to grade it.
Okay, so give me 100.
What decisions were made? The delegates chose George Washington to preside as leader. And you know what happens after that? He becomes president. So Washington chose a committee to set rules for conducting the convention, which still actually happens today. There's a rules committee in Congress, and they are really put there to make sure that certain procedures are followed during congressional sessions. Decisions would be made by majority vote, with each state having one vote. And remember, there's 13 states at this moment, but Rhode Island's not there. Delegates agreed to keep all discussions secret to enable all to speak freely because, again, now everything's public. You can watch every single congressional word live on C-SPAN if you want, but back then it was very secretive, and it was for a very, very long time. So, what decisions were made? So we're going to start getting into these compromises. So the delegates decided to discard the Articles of Confederation and write a new constitution. They weren't sure they were going to do that, but now they know. So the meeting came to be known as the Constitutional Convention.
Constitutional Convention.
Yes. Some issues at the convention. So we have representation. James Madison from Virginia designed a plan called the Virginia Plan. It called for a government with 3 branches, which we all enjoy, right? The separation of powers. We have the legislative branch, which is the lawmakers, executive branch, they carry out the laws and enforce the laws, and the judicial branch is a system of courts that interprets and applies the law. The legislature would be bicameral, meaning 2 houses. We've already gone over that. You've seen it in your crash courses. And states represented by basis of population. So under the Virginia Plan, it is only based upon population. Who do you think that would benefit? Smaller states or larger states?
What'd you say?
Bigger.
Yeah.
2 houses? Oh.
No. If representation was only based on population.
Oh, yeah, then the bigger thing.
The bigger states. And then the smaller states wouldn't have a voice like the larger states would. So the smaller states hated this. Okay, it was known as the Virginia Plan, and it really benefited large states because they had more people. Then we have William Patterson. He designed the New Jersey Plan, so you can probably understand that this was going to benefit the smaller states. So this also called for 3 branches of government, so that's an agreeable, moment here. The legislature would be unicameral, having 1 house, and each state would get 1 vote. Now, we've seen in the past, in the colonies, in Parliament, and all that kind of stuff, it becomes bicameral, 2 houses, and it seems to work well. This plan says, okay, let's do 1 house, and everything's equal. So this plan would give equal power to large and small states. But there's kind of a problem there, because population does matter, right? If more people live in a certain state, then their voices should be heard, but there also should be a moment where if it comes down to it, it's not based on population, it's based on equal representation, which we experience now in the Senate. So, let's meet in the middle.
So is that what the Senate was made for?
Yes, equal representation. It is known as the upper house in Congress, meaning that you have to be a little bit more distinguished to be there, so you have to be older. You have to be 30 years old to be there. And in the House of Representatives, you don't have to be 25 years old. So it's known as the upper house, a little bit more distinguished, and things have to actually get through the Senate a little bit more than they would in the House of Representatives. So compromise, Roger Sherman created the Great Compromise. All right, the Connecticut Plan. This is your exit ticket.
Oh.
So he says that in the Senate there should be equal representation for all states. All right, perfect. Nowadays we have 2 representatives in the Senate, so 2 senators per state, 100 total, and the vice president votes on the tie if they end in a tie. And then the House of Representatives is based upon population. So right now in the House of Representatives we have 435 members, and it's all based upon population. So what state has the most representatives in Congress? The most populated state, which would be California. All right? So I think North Carolina has 13 representatives.
What is your exit ticket? What number is it? 311?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. So here's an issue that comes to the forefront of the Constitutional Convention. Counting slaves for representation. If you've taken an American history class before, you know the answer to this. But if you haven't, you might not. So southern states they want to count slaves as a part of the population in determining representation in the House of Representatives.
That's crazy.
So, but if you do count slaves as a person, then...
Whoa. Sorry.
So for each like if you actually count 1 slave be 1 person, that would mean that they weren't property.
Yeah, so that's why they did the 3/5.
Right, and so they wanted to count these, these slaves as people, but they didn't want to call them necessarily people. They still wanted to own them as property. It's kind of messed up.
So like just enough.
It's not kind of messed up. It's super messed up. But back then, it was like it wasn't as taboo, I guess, as it sounds now.
Well, yeah.
But yeah, it's the southern states wanted that to happen. They wanted more representation. They were kind of fighting for power and using slaves to get that power. Northern states do not count slaves as a part of the population at all. Now, were there slaves there in the northern states at this time?
Well, yeah.
Yes. So if you end up counting slaves, in the South, their population they skyrocket, and it becomes, fairly even. If you don't, not so much. So the compromise, counting slaves for representation. They decided that each slave, for every 5 slaves, you count 3 people, meaning that slaves were considered 3/5 of a person. So they called it the 3/5 compromise. Every 5 slaves would count as 3 free persons for determining representation in the House of Representatives and figuring taxes. It's crazy,
So,
but imagine a group of 55 white males. Yeah, they're probably going to decide something like this.
am I supposed to be writing this down or no?
No.
Okay.
All right, then we have the commerce and slave trade. So northern states, they want Congress to be able to regulate foreign trade and trade between the states. So they want to give government a little bit of power here, the northern states. The southern states feared Congress would tax their exports and stop the slave trade, messing with their economy. This has kind of always been the case. Not necessarily, we're not talking about slave trade, but we're talking about like regulations at least. Northern states don't mind too many, regulations are okay because it seems to be a little bit more liberal up north and more conservative down south. And conservatives want less regulation from government, so less government involvement. So here we go, the compromise, the commerce and slave trade compromise here. Congress has the power to regulate trade, all right? Congress could not tax exports. So if you sent goods across the Atlantic Ocean, they couldn't tax that. And Congress could not interfere with the slave trade before 1808. They decided, okay, that at 1808, no more slaves could be brought to the United States.
Yeah.
They could be born into slavery, but they couldn't be brought here like a commodity.
You just can't have yeah.
So in 1808 is whenever that pretty much stopped, even though they were still smuggled in occasionally. All right, next issue. Choosing the president. So delegates disagreed on this particular thing because, again, they're kind of scared of the president in the first place because they just came from the rule of the king. Congress should choose the president, or voters should choose the president. The compromise was the Electoral College, which is still going on today. A lot of people say we are past this and we should be directly voting for a population. It should be the popular vote, not necessarily the Electoral College vote, because it is a system that you can kind of manipulate. So the Electoral College is a group of people named by each state legislature to select the president and the vice president. Back then, they didn't even have to really follow what the state voted for. So you could live in North Carolina. North Carolina could be like a majority, their majority is voting for John Adams or something like that. And the Electoral College, right, their representatives from North Carolina could say, they don't know what they're talking about. They're poor and dumb. And they could say, we're going to put Thomas Jefferson in there instead. They could do something like that. Today, the voters in each state, not the legislatures, choose the electors. So what happens today is we would vote, the popular vote of North Carolina would get all of our Electoral College votes, and they would have to follow that. So the electors of the Electoral College would have to just agree with what the majority of North Carolina decides. They don't necessarily have to, but if they don't, guess what? Bad things would happen.
Yeah.
What about Tally?
Yeah, probably some sort of uprising. I don't know how or what would happen, but
From what? I wasn't listening.
people.
No, but like what?
Oh, if the electors from the Electoral College did not vote in the way that North Carolina voted,
Oh, yeah.
there might be a
That's
big
what a few
problem.
of the states did this year.
Well, they wanted to.
Oh, yeah.
People were saying that they should do that, but none of them really did. Come on, work. All right, approving the Constitution. So the Constitution was signed on September 17th, 1787. That's actually known as Constitution Day. We have to teach about the Constitution on that day. It's like a state requirement. Ratification, another word for approval, required at least 9 of 13 states to vote yes. So Federalists, those were a group of people who believed in the Constitution. They wanted a strong central government. Again, the Articles of Confederation didn't give that to them. And then there was the Federalist Papers. Some notable Federalist Papers were sort of like pamphlets that were handed out to people. But Hamilton, okay, Alexander Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, they were all proponents of this Federalist mindset. Strong central government. Give the power to the central government.
Central government.
Come on. Why isn't this work? All right, the Anti-Federalists. They wanted a strong state government. So they didn't really care about having a strong federal government. They thought the states could handle it themselves. They wanted a Bill of Rights to protect individual freedoms, and you know that we end up getting that. So the final compromise was the Bill of Rights. They both agreed to add a Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments, the first 10 changes of the Constitution. This promise turned the tide in favor of ratification of the new Constitution, and the states ended up voting for it.
Why don't you just put the projector on the ceiling?
That's a great question. Okay, so approving the Constitution. The Constitution took effect when New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify it on June 21st, 1788. North Carolina approved the Constitution after it was already approved. Isn't that sad? All right.
I don't know, that's stupid.
Back then, North Carolina always followed suit to what South Carolina did, so they always waited for what South Carolina was going to do, and then boom, they'd do it. Usually in a real class, I'd make you draw a Venn diagram, and then we put all of these things in the different places, and then, yeah. This is a good thing to study. You can imagine a question about this on your test. We have the government under the Articles of Confederation and the government under the Constitution. And this is just going to compare and contrast the two. So you can see government under the Articles of Confederation, a loose alliance of independent states, one House legislature, no executive or judicial branches, only states can tax, states may coin money, so every state is going to have a different monetary unit, no regulation of trade between states, and most power is held by states. And then you look at the government under the Constitution. It's a national government representing all citizens, 2 House legislature, the executive and judicial branches are established. Congress is given the power to tax, meaning that it can get some sort of revenue. Only the national government may coin money, which is awesome because you can go between states and spend that money. National government regulates trade between states. And then power is shared by national and state government. That is called federalism. And that brings us to the end of our lesson today.
Woo!
So, that's a good thing to watch if you get a chance. It's like it puts the Constitutional Convention into like a one news day. I don't know. It's a cool thing to watch. I'll probably show it in class. And that's it. All right. Any question?
No. But I mean, why don't you put the projector on the ceiling?
It's not me.
Why?
I mean, Hoggard has projectors on the ceiling. I don't know why. I don't know why the school isn't like updated. I'm not sure.
Why would you put it
Well,
on the
some
ceiling?
people have their projectors on the ceiling.
Why would you do
Yeah,
that?
who?